Jim Comey said that the rationale used by the president to fire him was a lie and called the president a liar.
I'm Igor, and welcome to this bonus episode of Thinking Cap. We're sitting here in the studio just a couple of hours after the much anticipated testimony of former FBI Director James Comey. He testified for, 3-4 hours about his interactions with President Trump and the state of the ongoing investigation into the president's relationship with Russia and his campaign's communications with Russian officials. I'm joined now by Max Bergmann. He is a former official at the State Department. He was there under President Obama and now serves as a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and is director of the Moscow Project here at CAP. Max, welcome to Thinking Cap.
Thanks for having me, Igor.
A big day for you, a busy day, I'm sure, so thank you for joining us. Before we get into the guts of what Comey finally told us after, CNN said there were like 72 hours, they had that counter,
Yes.
and it was finally here, let's give our listeners a taste of how we got here and why today was so highly anticipated.
Well, we got here because of the actions of President Trump, and that starts with him firing James Comey. Before Comey was fired, people said, well, he could never fire Comey because if he fired Comey, then he clearly would be trying to get rid of the Russia investigation. And then when he fired James Comey and then later admitted that, it became clear that we had a situation in which the President of the United States was trying to essentially shut down an investigation into his White House and into his campaign. And then later, the revelations that have come out after the Comey firing, noting a clear fact pattern of efforts by the president to quash the investigation by putting pressure on Comey through personal meetings, through having dinners, all of that, that's how we got here. That's how we've gotten to this point where the former director of the FBI, someone who's been appointed by both Democratic and Republican administrations, calls the president a liar.
And you're referring here to Donald Trump's request that James Comey, who was at the time looking at Michael Flynn's, the former National Security Advisor's, connections to Russian officials, meetings he had with Russian officials before the President Trump was sworn in, Trump asking Comey if he could find a way to let that go.
Right. I think Michael Flynn was a clear point in which made President Trump very nervous, and that's where he deliberately sought to intervene to say, hey, let's just let Mike Flynn, he's a good guy. Don't you agree he's a good guy? We should just, drop this. But I think it also goes beyond Mike Flynn, that the investigation that Comey, when he testified in March, said that what he was looking into, what he was investigating, was the Trump campaign's links to the Russian government. And so that goes beyond Michael Flynn. It brings in his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, brings in Carter Page, and it now looks like it brings in Jared Kushner. So this is an investigation that is sprawling, and so it was both Flynn was sort of the point that it seems Trump got very nervous about and therefore tried to exert pressure, but it goes beyond, I think, Michael Flynn.
Well, let's get to Comey's testimony from today. What are the key moments that stood out for you, and what did we learn today that we previously didn't know?
I think the key moment started right away, and that's when Jim Comey said that the rationale used by the president to fire him was a lie. And
said a lie
and called the president a liar. And, the L word is frequently dodged in Washington and in American politics. And Comey just went out and said that the rationale used was not true. It was a lie. And so that, I think, was sort of the first thing that sort of hit me over my head, and I think everyone else. I think the second thing was that what Comey basically confirmed today was that as part of the Mueller investigation will be obstruction of justice. And that was something that was not the case when Comey was fired. But the fact pattern that I think Comey laid out in both his testimony and then in his written testimony and in his oral testimony laid out a clear grounds for obstruction of justice And when asked about it, he said that's not up to him to determine. It's up to the special prosecutor Mueller. And so I think that was another major feature of the hearing today. And I would say the last point was something that was said very quickly, was about Sessions. And Comey noted that Sessions didn't just recuse himself because he effectively lied to Congress about his meetings with the Russian ambassador, but because of something else that he couldn't reveal in an open session and had to be a closed session. So there was another aspect to Sessions' recusal, which is really fascinating, and there's a lot of speculation about what that could be.
Now, how is the Trump administration responding? There was some speculation before this testimony that, well, maybe Trump would be live tweeting as Comey testified. That didn't happen, but his lawyer did go out and respond to what Comey said today.
Yeah, so his lawyer went out and effectively said that Comey lied under oath and called Comey a liar. So we now have a situation in which the President of the United States is accusing the former FBI director of perjuring himself. I would also point out...
And lied about what specifically?
Well, I think the lied about the meetings that took place. So when Comey was very specific about how Trump tried to put pressure on him, and the president came out and said that was not true and lied about sort of the specifics of the conversation. I think what totally undercuts that is that the Republicans on the committee all noted effectively to a T that they all considered Comey to be exceptionally truthful, exceptionally honest. Maybe they disagreed with him at times. So Trump is really at odds with the Republicans that were on the committee. The other thing that the Trump White House or the lawyer tried to point out was to say that, well, Comey effectively admitted to leaking information to the New York Times after he had left or been fired as FBI director. And this to me is a little bit like it's as if you're kind of comparing the fire truck that is double parking with the arsonist, right? The fire truck may be essentially violating parking laws by double parking, but it's just not the same thing as the arsonist who committed the fire. And so Comey leaking to reporters or through his friend that there were unclassified notes that he took, contemporaneous notes about the meetings with Donald Trump, strikes me as incredibly pertinent. And we shouldn't forget our history here, that Deep Throat was in the FBI in Watergate and leaked information. Was Deep Throat, I think we can look back and say, was an American hero for leaking this information. So they're really trying to distract and deflect attention from them.
And the other piece here that I think Comey returned to time and time again is really the gravity of the reason for why this hearing is happening in the first place, and that is Russian meddling in our election process. That this shouldn't be, Comey said directly, an issue that only Republicans care about or Democrats care about, that this strikes really at the fundamental core, the underpinning of who we are as a country.
Right. And I thought that was one of the best moments, strongest moments of the hearing today. You know, this is not really about Republicans or Democrats. What the Russians did is they intervened in our election and also created a model for not just Russia to do this again, but perhaps for another country, whether that's China or any other country that has similar intelligence tools, similar capabilities. And the fact is, in the last 5 months since the intelligence community report has come out and said effectively that our democracy was attacked, the United States has done nothing. And one thing that was revealed is that Trump expressed no concern throughout his interactions with Comey about Russian interference. It was all about the investigation impacting him potentially. And so that kind of starts to tell you something. And one of the things that I find particularly concerning is that Congress has yet to act. It's been 5 months, and yet no legislation, no action has been taken in order to respond to Russia, to harden our defenses so this doesn't happen again.
Now, Comey answered some questions, provided some details. He, for instance, had to cancel a dinner date with his wife to meet with
Right.
the president during their so-called loyalty dinner. But what did he refuse to talk about? There were moments when he said, I can't talk about this in open setting, and they may have discussed this in the classified testimony that he gave following the public hearing. But what are still some of the key outstanding questions that we have about how Trump interacted with Comey and, of course, then Trump and the Trump administration's larger connections to Russia and possibly helping Russia swing the election?
So I think this is one of the key points that people sort of struggle with, to sort of say, well, where's the evidence of collusion? And the fact is that what we know is that the intelligence community throughout between 2015 and throughout the election picked up through our own sophisticated intelligence means, but also through the intelligence capabilities of our European allies, numerous contacts and interactions between Trump associates and Russian-linked officials. And so what Comey refuses to talk about in an open setting is essentially the wiretaps or information gleaned from phone calls and other human sources of these contacts and interactions, of the evidence effectively of collusion. And so that is all highly classified because of the means at which that information is gathered. And so that is one of the major frustrations and why it's sort of hard for folks to talk about the investigation, because because we're dealing with a foreign power, right? We're not. This isn't Nixon and Watergate where it's all internal. That we are dealing with U.S. intelligence tools which aren't designed for public to be released publicly. So what we get into is Comey constantly being asked, do you have evidence of collusion? And he says, I can't talk about it in a closed setting or in an open setting. I need to talk about that in a closed setting. So there's a lot of evidence here. So when people say there's no evidence of collusion, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here today if there wasn't. The FBI doesn't open a counterintelligence investigation into American individuals, especially individuals linked to a political campaign, unless they have grounds to do so and have a lot of information that points them in that direction.
And from what is publicly available, from what we publicly know from your work here on the Moscow Project, what is the most damning piece of evidence that we have that points to collusion?
I think one of the most damaging pieces is simply all the contacts that we now know about, that we have learned after the fact. And then when you look at the cast of characters that Trump had around him, someone like Paul Manafort, who is effectively a Kremlin oligarch. He has received millions of dollars from Kremlin-linked officials, worked with the Ukrainian ousted leader Viktor Yanukovych. And then you go to Michael Flynn, who received payments from the Russian government and refused to report them. And then you look at Carter Page, someone who we know in 2015 was actively recruited by Russian intelligence. And this was reported by the FBI when they busted a Russian spy ring. And yet Carter Page somehow a year later gets onto the campaign. He then goes to Moscow in the midst of the campaign when it was approved by Corey Lewandowski. And lastly, and there's many other points, but we also know that Roger Stone knew before anyone else that John Podesta's emails were going to come out. And how did Roger Stone know this, I think is one critical question. Now, there's been a lot of other reporting. A lot of it is not perfectly sourced. But the last point that I would make is that when you look at what Director Clapper, former Director Clapper, former CIA Director Brennan basically walked through how the Russians turn folks and to become Russian agents. And what he was doing was saying a hypothetical, but he was pointing out what he was seeing. And what he was seeing is that the Russians use leverage and then they exact influence over people to both extract information and to influence how those campaigns are working. So I think there's many examples of collusion, but what I think what we need to have happen is the investigation to go forward and to do a full and comprehensive look at the entire picture.
Yeah, Max, and before I let you go, a lot of people are going to be reading the news about today's testimony and asking themselves, what can we do? What can we do to ensure that this is handled in an appropriate way and that we ultimately get down to the bottom of exactly what happened, not just with Trump, but with Russia's what may be ongoing efforts to influence our election, not just the 2016 election, but the elections to come.
Right. I think the main thing is that we desperately need an independent commission. Now, an independent commission has sort of two roles. During 9/11, they had one role was to figure out how 9/11 happened, but the other role was to figure out what do we do about it. And in trying to figure out what to do in response to 9/11, we had to restructure our entire U.S. national security bureaucracy. We created the Department of Homeland Security. We set procedures so FBI and CIA shared information before that they didn't when they hadn't before. And we need something similar now. We need to figure out how to respond to this, how to make it so our election systems are seen as critical infrastructure and can't be hacked, how the FBI should respond to potential hackings of political campaigns. And we also need to figure out what cyber tools that we have at our disposal to protect ourselves. So I think we need a commission to figure out what we should do. And the Congress has the ability to create one. Through a veto-proof majority, they could vote to create one without the vote of a president. And the last thing I would say, we need to deter other countries from doing this again. And one of the easiest ways that we can do that is through additional economic sanctions against Russia. There's currently a bill stuck in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that has 10 Republican co-sponsors and 10 Democratic co-sponsors, and that's currently being blocked by Senator Bob Corker. And we need that legislation to not just deter Russia from doing this again, but to send a message to other countries.
Max Bergmann is a former State Department official under the Obama administration. He now serves as a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and is a director of the Moscow Project here at CAP. Max, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thinking Cap is produced by Sally Tucker, music by Kyle Epstein and Jacob Buchanan, graphics by Matt Ingram. For more, find us at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and at AmericanProgress.org, or wherever you want.